Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Like every Friday, I'm Glenn Kreutz, a member here of the Rotary Club, and excited today to introduce a friend of mine as our speaker, Bob Wettemann. Bob is a history professor at the Air Force Academy. Bob, by way of background, grew up in Stillwater, Oklahoma. His father was a professor of animal science there at Oklahoma State University. Bob grew up there and himself went to Oklahoma State for his undergraduate. Like me, he got his PhD, his in history, at Texas A&M University. So he's a land-grant kid, Oklahoma State and Texas A&M. And he currently is a professor of history at the Air Force Academy. He started out earlier as a historian studying the Jacksonian era, and then gradually has come into the 20th century, including the topic he'll talk with us about today. His next project, by the way, is very exciting. It relates to the air campaign in the early 20th century around the world. Maybe we can have him back to talk about that one as well. One other thing I can't resist raising is that I was in the Stillwater Frontier Rotary Club there in Stillwater with Bob's father, also Bob, Dr. Robert Wettemann, and often sat at the same table with him. And so it's really, really neat to have you here, Bob, as our speaker today. And without further ado, Bob Wettemann.
See, I'm going to turn my stopwatch on so I don't run over time. Thanks, Glenn. It's great to be here today. It's great to be with Rotary. I know my father is fond of that organization, and again, my pleasure to be here. So this is a project that started about 20 years ago. And, you know, as a historian, we're obligated in higher academics to publish or perish. And in the interim, from the time I started to the time I completed this project, I wrote another book, about 3 or 4 book chapters, a couple of articles, moved across country 3 or 4 times, and have probably written more on this in the last 3 years in completing the project than I had previously. But I got started with this as a product of the film Saving Private Ryan, and you'll see that when we go along. But the question that I had in trying to understand the American GI during World War II. And I said, how do you understand what that was like? And part of it I came to, if I can go to the next slide, is understanding what life was like in the 1930s, growing up in the Great Depression. The first chapter of my book I call Tom Swift, Model Ts, and Growing Up American. And in looking at growing up American, I got into American popular culture, looking at things like Popular Mechanics, Tom Swift, the Hardy Boys, where machine technology was always at the forefront. And, you know, during the Great Depression, what did you do? You used it up, you wore it out, you made it do, or you did without, which is going to take kind of a tinkerer's mentality. So you think about that tinkerer's mentality in the larger context of the machine. The World War II GI being the first generation that grew up from the beginning with access to the internal combustion engine. And when you think about those automobiles as they functioned in the 1930s, they're not the same kind of cars that we drive today where you toss your fob in the console, push the button, and it starts, right? You had to worry about the choke, your magneto. Somebody had to crank it and get it going. You know, George Marshall in 1916, when he was stationed out in the Philippines, he bought a Model T and he said he took it apart and put it back together just to understand how it worked. And one advantage that the American GI had over soldiers throughout the rest of the world, next slide, is when you look at the number of automobiles that were available in the United States versus the rest of the Axis and Allies combined. That's essentially one car for every family of 4 in the United States. So those are significant numbers to me when you look at familiarity with machines. And because of that, as George Marshall said, next slide please, in the appropriation bill by which the Army would divest itself of horses and replace it with motorized vehicles, just about every young man had this machine understanding. Now, as that gets translated into World War II, almost from the very beginning, when the American GI faced some type of challenge, as Douglas MacArthur would say when he was superintendent at West Point, next slide please, improvisation will be the watchword. And you see that from the very moment the war began. The attack on Pearl Harbor, maintainers there on Kaneohe Airfield, dragging out tool benches, clamping machine guns in devices just so they could return fire, taking that tinkerer's mentality and making it work, using it up, wearing it out, making do without. Just a few short months after Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Forces had the idea, we are going to bomb Japan. We are going to launch 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers off the deck of the aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet, and fly to Japan. We're going to try to bomb Tokyo. Now, doctrine at the time called for high altitude bombing. The bomb site that the United States used, the Norden bomb site, was designed for use at high altitude. Well, the B-25s on the Tokyo raid were going to come in low. So really you couldn't use the Norden bomb site. On top of that, the B-25s were going to plan on ditching in either China or the Soviet Union. And that bomb site was top secret technology, so you didn't want it to fall into enemy hands. So James Doolittle, commanding the mission, turned to his bomb officer, Charles Greening. Next slide, please. And he came up with just a few pennies of scrap aluminum with what they called the Mark Twain. And you see it down there, slide, there we go. You see it down there in the bottom left. Kind of resembles the side wheel paddle boat on the Mississippi River, hence the name. Had V-shaped notches on either end, you could adjust it based upon airspeed, and you had a serviceable bomb site that you didn't have to worry about it falling into enemy hands when you ditched further on. This idea of making do with what you had was very much at the center when George Kenney got posted to be MacArthur's airman down with the 5th Air Force in Australia. Next slide, please. And as he said, the salvage pile, that was our source of spare parts, because early on in the war, what did the United States and Great Britain decide the overall Allied strategy was going to be? Germany first. So anything in the Pacific, you were just having to make do with what you had. And Kenney turned to who he ended up calling his super gadgeteer and all-around fixer. Next slide, please. Gentleman by the name of Paul Pappy Gunn. And I'm not sure why the pictures aren't coming through. They show up on my slides. I'm not seeing them here. But, well, no, there's one in the upper right that's blank. Can you go back one and then jump ahead and see if it pops? There we go. There's Kenney. And then go ahead. There it is. So Kenney turned to Pappy Gunn, and before Kenney had gone out to the Pacific, he did what every self-respecting officer would do. He went out and started scrounging things. And he found a bunch of fragmentation bombs that were designed to spread shrapnel when they detonated. And he had those shipped to Australia and rigged with parachutes. So when you drop them at low altitude to increase your accuracy, and they fell on Japanese aircraft, as you see down there over the Dutch East Indies in 1943, the parachute would slow the dropping of the bomb so that when the bomb detonated, when it hit the ground, you wouldn't have collateral damage to your own aircraft. And Kenney put Pappy Gunn to work building what they called squirrel cages into the backs of B-25s, just using scrap metal, whatever they salvaged from the junk heap, to make it work. And then Kenney had the bright idea. He came to Pappy Gunn and he said, Pappy, how many machine guns can you put into the nose of a B-25? And he just turned them loose and let them go. And Pappy Gunn ended up with a package of 12 machine guns, utilizing the 2 that were also in the top turret. 50 caliber machine guns, each one spitting out a bullet about the size and diameter of your thumb. And he developed very effective, what they came to call commerce raiders, that were directed against Japanese surface shipping, that were relatively lightly armored, if armored at all. And they used them to great effectiveness, particularly at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March of 1943. The forerunner really to the A-10, if you think about it. But this is something that was just kind of crafted by the seat of their pants as they went along. And this was something you see consistently, largely because of the nature of World War II as the first mechanized war. In 1942, the author John Steinbeck, who you probably remember from writing the book The Grapes of Wrath, in which the truck was almost a character of its own as the Jodes were trying to nurse it together, driving across from Oklahoma to California. In 1942, Steinbeck was sent around to the nation's airfields where they were training the bomber pilots and crewmen that were going to fly during World War II. And the result, Steinbeck wrote the book, next slide please, Bombs Away, which is a literary version of an Air Force recruiting poster in which you had men like Bill the bombardier, Al the aerial gunner, Alan the navigator, Joe the pilot, and Abner the aerial engineer. And Abner was the guy, as Steinbeck describes him, that was in every small town in the United States working at the gas station. And Abner's jalopy never looked the same 2 weeks in a row because he's always tinkering with it, adding this, taking this off, using that tinkerer's mentality that would be used to great effect once the United States and Great Britain began launching the combined bomber offensive. When you start bombing Germany, very early on, air crews came to recognize that their most vulnerable location was coming in at what they called 12 o'clock high, directly in line with the front of the aircraft coming towards where the pilot and the co-pilot sat. The Germans figured that out. They started attacking the B-17s from that direction because the B-17s at the time did not have machine guns in the nose of the aircraft. Some guys figured this out, started scratching their heads and said, okay, we need to solve this problem. Next slide, please. And three different squadrons all came up with almost the same solution at the same time, but were 30 to 40 miles apart from each other in Great Britain. So this tells you about the mentality of the American airmen, that there's something consistent with all of them. I found similar instances where I found 4 different examples of guys who figured out, built tools in order to remove the wheels off of the hubs of aircraft. One in China, one in Italy, one in England, one in North Africa, all built essentially the same type of machine at the same time because they recognized a problem and they figured out a solution. And you see this consistently over and over, where there's a need that is recognized, and guys quite literally out underneath the wing of an airplane at night come up with a solution by just tinkering around with the machinery that you already have. You saw this in Italy in an effort to make the P-47 Thunderbolt into, from what it was designed to do, being a high-altitude bomber escort, into the premier close air support platform during World War II. Rerouting the means by which you could drop the external fuel tanks, the levers for which were back behind the pilot seats. If you think about sitting in an aircraft and you got your stick here and you're trying to reach back here and put bombs accurately on a target, Bill Hahn and Dwight Orman were tasked by their commanding officer, you need to figure out how to mechanically reroute those wire cables so we can put them all right up front. And you see those little toggle handles right there at the bottom of the instrument panel, that they had rerouted the release lever from back behind the seat through a fulcrum, pull those wires up underneath the seat right up front. Then you slapped on top of that a bomb sight that they scavenged from a British Spitfire, and now you can put your bombs on target. This is what made the P-47 into the best close air support platform during World War II. to the point that as Patton's Third Army is racing across France, they didn't have to worry about their flanks. They didn't have to worry about what was going on to the east and to the west as they made their advance, because they had air cover. They had air cover largely through the efforts of Pete Quesada, who will command the 9th Tactical Air Command, who worked very closely with General Omar Bradley to the point that you actually had Air Force officers in tanks, in armored columns, with radios taken out of airplanes that would allow those Air Force officers to talk to pilots in the air, because tankers, tank drivers, and Air Force pilots saw things very differently. So there was this close cooperation as this ingenuity plays out. And then you have instances like what I found happened on the 5th of July, 1944, 1 month after the Normandy invasion. General Eisenhower was meeting with Bradley and the commanders of the First Army, thinking about the breakout from Normandy. And as the meeting was breaking up, Eisenhower turned to Pete Quesada, who you see in the front seat of that aircraft. And Eisenhower asked Quesada what was he going to do. And Quesada says, "I'm going to go fly on a mission. Do you want to go with me?" Eisenhower, who had gotten his private pilot's license during the Louisiana maneuvers, was intrigued, went with Quesada to the 355th Fighter Squadron, where that squadron had taken a P-51B model, known as a Razorback Mustang, because it didn't have that distinctive bubble canopy you typically see with the P-51 Mustang during World War II. But instead, the fuselage extended straight back from the cockpit. And in one of those planes, the members of the 355th, there was a gas tank and some radio equipment behind the pilot's seat. Well, they took that out. And they took that back window and made it into a hatch. And they put a little plywood seat in there that you could just squeeze somebody in. It was such a tight fit, you couldn't even have a parachute. And Quesada, the 2-star, took Eisenhower, the 4-star, plugged him in the back, and they went up over Normandy, which was still a contested battle space. This was the first time a ground combatant commander ever saw a battlefield from the air while the fighting's still taking place. Quesada said years later, Eisenhower, as he's getting in the plane, sees Omar Bradley, who's kind of concerned, and Eisenhower reportedly said, "Don't worry, Brad, we're not flying to Paris." But when they landed, Bradley says they looked like two schoolboys that had been caught in a watermelon patch. Years later, Quesada said, "Well, suppose you had gotten into a dust-up with some Germans. What were you going to do?" And Quesada said in this oral history interview, "Well, I was going to fly out over the English Channel and invert and try to dump Eisenhower out, because there was no way he could get out of the plane by himself." So as the war continues, there we go. George Patton understood this. Americans are mechanics. We're going to tinker with things. We're going to make things work. We're going to use, next slide, please. Go back to sticky bomb 2. One more. One more. Back. Other direction. There we go. One more. There we go. Again, I talked about Saving Private Ryan and the sticky bomb. You think that might be something that Steven Spielberg cooked up for a movie. But in actuality, no, it really happened. You could take a standard issue GI sock, cram it with explosives, rig up a simple fuse. And they actually taught this at the tank destroyer school as early as 1943, which is where I found these photographs in a Popular Mechanics article. When I talked about George Marshall and that appropriations bill in 1940, one vehicle came to be emblematic of the American GI in Europe, and that was the Jeep. And if you don't think that those GIs tinkered with their Jeep and made the same sorts of modifications that Abner would have to his jalopy back at the gas station, you can see some examples of this here. The Germans thought every American was issued a Jeep. I came across an account of North Africa. There was a French soldier guarding a crossroads, and he heard some people coming up, advancing towards his position at night. And he said, "Halt and be recognized." And they said, "We're Americans." So he shot them all. And as they inspected the bodies the next morning, found out that they were all Germans. And they asked this French soldier, well, how did you know they weren't Americans? To which he replied, that's easy. If they were Americans, they would have driven up in a Jeep. Next slide, please. So here's the French countryside if you've ever been to Normandy, which is difficult to navigate because you're confined to relatively narrow roads with hedgerows on either side. Those hedgerows being anywhere from 6 to 8 feet high, 6 to 8 feet wide, trees, rocks, bushes, significant obstacles. And if you're going to drive your tank up against it, you're going to elevate the front of the tank and expose the bottom of the hull, which tends to be the most weakly armored portion of the tank. And there are a whole host of solutions that Americans struggled with as they tried to restore mobility to the battlefield. And it was Sergeant Curtis Coolin from New Jersey, of all places, I don't know if that's significant or not, who came up with the idea, if we go back to the beaches in Normandy, next one, and cut up those German tetrahedrons that they used to rip off the bottoms of landing craft and weld teeth onto the front of a tank. Maybe we can use those to carve through those hedgerows. And with it, the Rhino tank was born. They spent inordinate amount of time on the run-up to Operation Cobra so that as the time you're breaking out from Normandy, about 50% of Third Army tanks were all equipped with these hedgerow cutter devices. As you continue to move across northwestern Europe, American tankers realized that the armor on their Shermans, their medium tanks, wasn't necessarily stout enough to resist either the German 88 millimeter anti-tank gun or the Panzerfaust, the German version of the bazooka. So as Lieutenant Belton Cooper would write, they would put all sorts of odds and ends, sandbags, planks, bogey wheels, onto their Shermans, just if anything else, to slow down those tank rounds to the point that the tank's armor itself could prevent them from damaging and injuring the crew. So you see all sorts of examples of things that these guys out in the field, whether it's, you have an open-topped M10 tank destroyer, you put sandbags or logs or 3/4-inch plate and build a top for that turret. You slap sandbags, logs, even concrete, anything to slow those rounds down. And these are all things that kind of percolate from the bottom up, from the minds of the American GI. You see them make all types of modifications to different sorts of weapons. Now, right there in the center, Forrest Guth, you might remember Easy Company 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, the famed Band of Brothers. I had the opportunity to talk to him before he passed away. And not only did he do things like take the front pockets off of his M42 jump jackets and sew them up to the sleeves, you can see that on his left shoulder, so he could carry his pipe, extra grenades, ammunition. When he was in the Bulge with the rest of Easy Company outside of Bastogne, he actually figured out, simply by field stripping an M1 carbine and comparing it to the German machine pistol, he was the company armorer, so he had a set of tools to help maintain his men's weapons. He filed down the sear and was able to convert his M1 to shoot fully automatic. So instead of just one bullet for pull of the trigger, it kept firing as long as you kept your trigger depressed. Just because, having grown up in the Pennsylvania Dutch country on a farm, he was used to tinkering, right? You get some guys that say, well, what if we put 4 bazookas onto the back of a Jeep? Or I can take a lighter weight aircraft machine gun, put an M1 Garand buttstock to it with a carrying handle and the bipod off a Browning automatic rifle. Or we need to clear a minefield. Let's take some detonation cord, braid it together, strap it onto an inert mortar round, then we'll fire that into the minefield and then detonate it to blow a path in the minefield. Or if you're Major Charles Carpenter and you're flying a light Cessna airplane as a field artillery supporter and spotting enemy targets, maybe you want to have an offensive capability. So you strap a couple of bazookas to the wing of your little Cessna, and now you have what he called Rosie the Rocketeer. And not to think that this is confined just to the European theater of operations. I talked about Kenny in the Southwest Pacific. I'll jump to this one, and I'm going to focus a little to the gentleman on the right, Lieutenant Henry Bellman. And I'm sure Glenn Rex, I see him nodding his head. Henry Bellman was the only Oklahoma governor to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But before he was that, he grew up on a wheat field in Billings, Oklahoma, about 20 miles from my hometown. And went to Oklahoma A&M College at the time, and then became a Marine tanker in the Pacific. And very early on, one of his superiors identified him as someone who would make a good platoon commander. Because Henry was driving his tank, they were rolling along. Light tank did a really sharp turn and threw the track. Hank, as he was called at the time, climbed out, told the drivers, back up, move forward, back up. He's out there working with the crowbar, and in about 5 minutes had the tank track back on, and they were back on their maneuvers. Commanding officer went to him and said, "How did you know how to do that?" Henry replied, "Well, I've been around tractors on the farm since Dad sold the mules in the Depression. You're my platoon commander." And as they were filling out the rest of the platoon and figuring out who they wanted in that platoon, Henry Bellman suggested to his commanders, "We want all the 4-H and the FFA boys because they're going to be the ones who know their way around machines." At a time when the Marines did not have organic repair units within the tank battalions. It was left up to the tankers themselves to make those sorts of repairs. Well, not only did you have the ability to make repairs, but you had the ability to modify your tanks. And if you look at Henry sitting on the back of his M4 on Iwo Jima just 80 years and a few days ago, you see a number of modifications. The wooden planks on the sides of the tank that they installed to give them an extra layer of resistance to Japanese magnetic mines. There was about a 2-inch space between those wooden planks that they filled with concrete. They put water tanks on the backs of the tanks so the guys on the ground, the Marines, could go and get water as they were moving along. You see on right below where Henry is sitting on that back, almost mud flap, there's a satchel there that says phone. So the Marines could come up and say, we need suppressing fire. Well, where do you need it to go? To the right on the waiting stack, you see target clock, and 12 was noted as the front. So we need suppressing fire at 130 low. Tank would drop its turret, move it around, just as the Marines reported on the outside. So I talked about Henry Bellman and his rural upbringing. His upbringing was not entirely unlike that of Dwight Eisenhower, who grew up in rural Abilene, Kansas. And as Eisenhower recognized very early on, there was something unique about American soldiers. Part of it from their upbringing, part of it from having access to machines, growing up with Tom Swift, the Hardy Boys, Popular Mechanics, so that when the war came and when they faced a problem, they could solve it with Rhino tanks and sticky bombs. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions? All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. If you would stand up, please.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I wonder if you can think about similar kinds of ingenuity that we're seeing today. And of course, I'm thinking particularly about Ukraine and the kinds of things that they're doing. I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I mean, you see the similar sorts of things. Again, I think in the contemporary environment, the origins of it, insofar as being really, as I argue, part of American culture in the 1930s and 40s, it's a different world now when it comes to technology. But even when you think back to in the early phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom and the challenges that you had as you're using Humvees as escort vehicles, and what do they end up doing, right? Covering them with sandbags on the floor, cutting out scrap armor, mounting it to the doors, building turrets, kind of converting something the Humvee wasn't designed to do into something that worked. You know, the challenge that I had that I thankfully didn't wrestle with in the book is kind of where we are with that sort of thing now. But you know, I can't help but wonder, thinking back to, and I know I'm dating myself, but the movie Independence Day, you know, with Jeff Goldblum, you know, how did they solve the problem, right? And is their efforts to solve the problem uploading the virus to take out, you know, the protection system to the alien spacecraft? Are we not going to have some E-Force somewhere in Space Force with, you know, his horn rim glasses with a tape over the nose, putting it, oh, I think we can do this. Is that going to be the solution?
Would you like to stand up? Thank you.
Are you aware of Bob Hoover in the history of aviation?
Yes.
I was acquainted with him in the 1970s. I'm 91 now, but and I have a history of aviation. But have you done work on Hoover and other illustrative?
I'm familiar with him and have dealt with him in other issues. The project I'm currently working on that Glenn alluded to, I'm working with the command historian at the Air Force Academy and another A&M undergraduate who went on and did his PhD at University of North Texas, flew the F-16. But the three of us are collectively working on what we're calling Contested Skies, a global history of World War II in the air, looking at how all the nations of the world attempted the primary missions of air power, that being, you know, attack, command of the air, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, as well as air mobility. All of the nations of the world are going to experiment with that in the first, you know, mechanized war in which air power plays a major role, but only the United States is going to be able to do all four well, largely because of how the United States developed as a country. So that's the project that we've got next on the hopper, but we'll certainly address, you know, those sorts of issues.
Thank you for your talk. I'm 99 this year, and I graduated from high school in 1944. And one after another of my classmates would push their chairs back and say, I had permission to go to war. And one of my favorite friends was Johnny Stout. And we were about to graduate in 1944, and he got permission to go to war. And he got up and he turned around to the class and he said goodbye. And before we graduated, he was on the Iwo Jima team and was killed. So lots and lots of memories. My uncle was with Patton's 5th in some of the most heavy war there was, and he did come home. And my first cousin was on the USS Arizona when you know what hit. So this is a lot of memories that emerge when I listen to you talk, and I thank you for speaking.
Thank you. One of the things I wrote in the book, when you think about some of the iconic imagery of World War II, you think of all the cartoons that were drawn by Bill Malden, who's with the 45th Infantry Division out of Oklahoma. And there's one where he's got his iconic soldiers, Willie and Joe, who are building a dugout, and it's all built out of spent 75 millimeter shell casings. And Willie pokes his head out of the dugout to Joe and says, "Hey, Joe, can you fire 3 more for effect? I need a stovepipe." But what I say in the book is everyone has their Grandpa Willie or their Uncle Joe that had some type of story, particularly as it relates to machines, coming out of World War II and the types of things that they did in order to win the war.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I guess my question is, do you view that moment in time as a unique moment in American history from the perspective of the ingenuity of the people at the time because of the much higher rate of vehicles, because of the access to mechanical experience, where we don't really possess that in today's society because everything has gotten so complicated that it's hard to fix a car anymore. And so do you view that as American ingenuity that persists to this day, or ingenuity that existed at a moment in time and has, to a certain extent, vanished?
There is a certain uniqueness to that point in time. You know, the idea that it's the first generation that grew up around internal combustion engines. And going back to my earlier comment, you know, we are so much of a disposable society today. When something breaks, you get rid of it. Your car doesn't work, you have to take it to somebody because it's been made in such a way that you can't do it. But I will tell you right now, my son is much better with this than I am. And you know, maybe it's the ability to use this type of technology as opposed to an internal combustion engine that the youth of today are truly much more expert in than we are.
Thank you, Bob. Fascinating talk. My question's about General and then later President Eisenhower. So my late father was in the Army when it was President Eisenhower, and he was very proud of that until his death, that he had been in the Army when Eisenhower was the commander-in-chief. And we got a big history lesson growing up in the Kreutz household about Eisenhower. So I've always been pretty fascinated. When the family and I went on vacations out here from Oklahoma, we'd drive through Abilene and stop and look around. And then, you know, his history of coming out to build the academy where you work, I think is compelling. I play golf, if anyone wants to play golf with me, at Highwan Golf Club in Evergreen, where Ike would play golf while they were building the Air Force Academy. We're very proud of that. I guess my question pertains to his influence on the academy. Do you feel that as a professor? Do the cadets feel that as they're going through this notion that there's a legacy there, a homage to this incredible leader?
I think if the cadets recognize Eisenhower's presence is when they're playing golf at the Eisenhower golf course. But I've had the opportunity over the past few years, I take a research trip with cadets, and we go from the Air Force Academy, and our first stop is in Abilene, Kansas. And we spend the night there, and then the next day we spend the better part of a day doing research in the Eisenhower Presidential Library and going through the museum there. And every time I go, I get a greater appreciation for not President Eisenhower, but as he wanted to be called after he was president, General Eisenhower. And in fact, after he was president, President Kennedy reinstated him as a general officer so he could continue to be called General Eisenhower, because that and growing up in Abilene, Kansas, those were the two things I think he was probably the proudest of.
We have a question online from Mike Simpson, so we're going to go to him next, okay? Mike, are you there? Are you able? Okay. Mike, can you unmute yourself, please? Okay. We're going to wrap it up, okay? Thank you.
Dr. Wettemann, I don't know if you were informed, but Rotary gets the last word, and I was selected to have the last word probably because I'm a World War II history geek. My book's a ways behind yours. My Willie and Joe are my Uncle Kenny and his twin brother Keith, one of whom fought in North Africa and one of whom fought in the Pacific. What you bring to us today are memories that, for a lot of us of a certain age, didn't experience, but our fathers did, and our uncles, and our, in some cases, grandfathers. It's history that is remarkable. When I work on the book that I'm working on my uncle and his twin, it's a remarkable story. And I was telling my wife the other day, it's remarkable, but it's not unique. There were millions of men who fought, did remarkable things, had remarkable experiences, but they were not unique. In any event, what you described for us is uplifting, interesting, and for those of us that are geeks, really, really exciting. And I appreciate it. One thing that we do at Rotary, and one of our passions, is the elimination of polio. And for the last 35 years plus, we've been working with a number of other organizations to eliminate that scourge. So we love to say we're this close, and we are, but it's an ongoing fight. So in your honor, we're going to be donating 100 doses of the polio vaccine to this effort. And again, we appreciate your time and really appreciate the content of what you told us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here.